welcome to the Royal BC Museum, and welcome to Live at Lunch. This is a free noon hour series that happens on the third Wednesday of each month. My name is Kim Goff, and I'm a learning program developer here. And I'm honored to work and learn on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen. Lekwungen means place to smoke herring. And today, the Lekwungen people are known as the Songhees and Shwepsum First Nation. And Shwepsum is formerly referred to as Esquimalt. Guided by our theme today, I'd particularly like to acknowledge the Lekwungen matriarchs, who past, present, and future, who are looking after the rich resources and cultural heritage of these lands. Today, in honor of International Women's Day, which was March the 8th, we welcome the Manager of Heritage Programs and Services at BC Heritage, Genevieve Weber. The BC Heritage Branch is the province's primary body responsible for the conservation of historic places, fossil management, and geographical naming in British Columbia. Genevieve Weber has a Master's in Archival Studies from UBC and joined the BC Heritage Branch in 2023. Prior to that, she'd spent 6 years as an archivist here at the BC Archives and 4 years as an archivist for the Government of BC. Her work in the archives, Indigenous communities, and now with the Heritage Branch has taken her around the province, and today she will share some of the stories of women as told through BC historic places. Please welcome Genevieve.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you to everybody for coming today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to especially thank Kim for inviting me because I think she knows I just like to tell stories. So that's what today is going to be about, is a way to think about heritage through the stories that women tell and through stories that are told about women in heritage sites. As Kim mentioned, I work at the Heritage Branch, and the Heritage Branch fulfills a number of functions and roles. And one of them is the conservation of heritage sites, so built heritage, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And the province owns and operates a number of heritage sites throughout the province. So a couple of them are really big. You might have heard of them, like Barkerville, which is an entire town, Fort Steele, which is also an entire town. But there's also a number of smaller heritage sites that are operated by the province. And for today's talk, I'm going to talk a bit about why women's stories are often harder to tell or are missed in traditional historic narratives. But I'm also going to highlight a couple of specific stories that are told through 2 heritage sites and heritage objects held in those sites here in the province. I would also like to acknowledge the Lekwungen people whose territory we're on today, as well as the Wasanich, where I live not far from here, is right on the border of Lekwungen and Wasanich territory. I'd also like to acknowledge a number of other Indigenous communities where these stories are coming from and located today, including Stahelis, Squelettes, in Clapkamak, and specifically Skewett, which is a community there, and the Stolo peoples as well, which covers a number of those communities that I just mentioned. I want to start by saying that this is not an academic presentation. I'm not an expert in any of the topics I'm about to talk about. As I said, I'm here to tell some stories. I want to talk a little bit too about how being involved in heritage sites and visiting heritage sites has helped me learn about women that I wouldn't have otherwise heard about. So this is a way to experience different stories and hear about history in a way that I wouldn't have or didn't when I was formally going through formal education, like taking a history degree. Going back, the names on the screen here, Chelsea Brown and Joanne Leon at the bottom, they work at the Kilby Heritage Site, which is one of the sites that I'll be featuring today. Marion Robinson is a friend of the family that own one of the heritage objects I'll be featuring. Maggie DeFazio is the current caretaker and owner of that object, and I don't want to give away what it is just yet. The 2 databases that I mentioned at the top, I have to put in a plug for the BC Archives database. If you haven't gone to the BC Archives, which is here, part of the Royal BC Museum, I highly recommend you do so. It's free. Everyone's allowed to be a member. There's some archivists in the room. I won't point them out, but if you're interested, I'll point them out after. And they can help you find some really interesting records that we have in our, I used to work here, I don't anymore, but that they have in their collections. And the Provincial Heritage Artifacts database is a little harder to find online, but if you go through the government website and search for heritage, you'll find it. And it's a database that captures images and information about all of the provincial heritage artifacts that are owned by the province. So most of those artifacts are kept in the heritage sites that we manage, but some of them are in storage, and there's some really fascinating things in there. So I recommend you go and check that out if you're looking for a rabbit hole to go down one day. So I wanted to talk a little bit about who I am and where I came from to set the scene for why I have an interest in all this stuff in the first place. I'm from a settler family that settled here on Vancouver Island at a number of different times, depending on which part of my family tree you're looking at. My dad's family are fairly recent post-war immigrants. They're from Poland and England, for the most part. My mom's family on my mom's side come from the prairies. But on my mom's dad's side, we can trace back our family lineage almost 9 generations, possibly exactly 9 generations, depending on how you look at the family tree. So all the way back to the Hudson's Bay Company, really early settlers in this area. And that's the part of my family tree that I want to talk a little bit about today. I grew up in Langford, which is just on the outskirts of Victoria. And that's where most of the family settled. They settled in the Highlands area, or in what is now Langford and Colwood and Metchosin. And I first became interested in heritage and history because of that long route that I had here in this area. So particularly speaking with my grandfather, he would tell me about stories that were connected to places and the land and the community that I lived in. We would walk around Langford and he would see buildings and he would be able to say, that's where your great-great-grandmother lived, or that's a building that I helped build with your uncle. There was a lot of these sites that held personal connections to me and my family. The photo on the top is a photo of my great-great-grandparents' house. It's at the corner of Atkins and Winster. If you've ever been to Langford, you might know where the RCMP office is. It's just behind the RCMP office. It was a very small, humble little house, as far as I understand. It was gone shortly after I was born, but I was born in the house directly next door to it, which you'll see a picture of in a second. The bottom photo is the Langford Fire Hall next to the Price's grocery store. These are not buildings that my family had direct connections to in terms of building, but they were places that there were stories about that I would hear about all the time. There were stories about the fire hall. It was a sort of gathering place where things would happen. There would be community events there. Price's grocery store, I had relatives that worked there. It was the only grocery store for a long time. There was one directly across the street for a while, and they were always in competition. So you would hear these stories growing up, and there was this real connection to these buildings. When we talk about heritage, that's often what people are talking about. They're talking about built heritage, meaning they're talking about tangible things that you can see on the ground, things that are built. And when we talk about heritage conservation, that's also usually what we're talking about. We're talking about buildings that have some sort of value, heritage value or cultural value that our society has determined should be protected in some way. But when you go around town and you see those buildings, now bear in mind I do work for the Heritage Branch, so I can't say anything too negative about it, but I do find it interesting that we really focus on the exterior of the building. So you might have seen recently there's a building that is currently being redeveloped at the corner of Hillside and Douglas. Beautiful facade, but really what they kept was 2 walls of the building. And the interior is being completely redeveloped. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's interesting if you think of it from a gendered perspective. What are we seeing in the heritage value there? We're seeing what was created and designed most likely by men, not necessarily, but most likely by men. It was built by men and constructed by men. The interior buildings is often where we see women reflected, and that is not necessarily valued and kept in the same way that maybe I think it should be. When I would walk around town with my grandfather and see these buildings, I was looking at the buildings. Often I was being told who built them, which was always men. But the stories that my grandfather would tell were always about women. So that house, there was stories about how my great-grandmother would bake donuts. And she was really good at baking donuts. and she would put them out on the windowsill, and all the neighborhood kids would come and eat them all, and they'd be gone in 5 seconds. And she used to sometimes joke that she could, try and put on a timer and see how fast they would go. There were stories about the gardening and about how my grandfather would, he was hired for a while to shoot the deer that were eating the asparagus from the asparagus farm across the way, and my grandmother would be the one who would prepare the meat and do that all in the barn that was behind their house. These stories are intangible aspects of our heritage that are passed down from generation to generation, and those, in my opinion, are just as important as the physical remnants of heritage that we see. The word heritage itself means things that we've inherited, or at least that's one of the interpretations of it, one of the definitions. And I really like that idea of what have I inherited? I have inherited some built remnants of my family, but I've inherited a lot of other things that come to me in intangible ways. And I was sort of always seeking that out when I was looking around town, looking for evidence of myself and my experience, which was not necessarily in that built heritage. I'm sharing this photo. This has nothing to do with women. Obviously, this is my uncle and a basketball player named Steve Dunbar, who he was sponsoring at the time. But I just really love this photo and wanted an excuse to share it more than anything. But this was my uncle's deli. My uncle's name was Raymond, or Ray, my uncle Ray. And the stories, again, the built heritage itself was not that important to me, but the stories that came with it were important. And I shared this photo a few years ago when my uncle passed away. I shared it on Facebook, and people were writing in memories, and so many of the memories were about my aunt. They were about my aunt being in that deli and selling, working there and talking to people and being sort of the person that drew everyone in and was sort of the hub and the sharer of information. And I really liked that part of the story. This is the house that replaced the house in the first slide. And this was the house that I lived in for the first 6 years of my life. So the little window next to the door was my bedroom. This was the house built for my great-grandparents by my grandpa and some of the other relatives for the kind of later in their life. And this house, again, is evidence, that built heritage evidence that we were there, our family was there. There's stories to be told there, but again, all the stories were about my great-grandmother. They were all about the women being in the house. So when I started at the Provincial Archives, even earlier than that, when I started studying to be a historian, and I think there's a few historians here, so maybe you can tell me if I'm on the right track with this. But when I started as a historian, and then later when I started to work at the Provincial Archives, I was looking for women in the records, in the evidence that is left behind. And they're really hard to find. And this is an entire other presentation, which I can't get into now, and I actually did a presentation on trying to find women in the archives a few years ago. There's lots of tips and tricks around how to do that. They are there, but they're wives and daughters and mothers and sisters, and often they're hidden behind the names of the men that they're connected to. So they're a lot harder to find. Usually the records that we keep are told from the perspective of the men, particularly here with the government archives. The government records, for the most part, are created by men. So that evidence of how our society has developed over time is definitely from a male perspective. So I came in, I looked for the name Scaife, which is my great-grandmother's name. There was a lot more than this, and they were all men. Until I finally scrolled down and I found evidence of the women. But even then, when I found the photo, it was listed as Mrs. William Robert Scaife. So I finally found it. Now, I was in a very lucky position of privilege, first of all, to even have evidence of my family in the archives. That's pretty rare. But also to be able to go in the back end and fix the record and add some information to it. So I did that. I added all the names of all of the people because I knew that not only was this Granny Scaife, my great-great-grandmother on the left, but that was her sister, Dade, or Daisy, on the far right. And those were three of her daughters in the middle, Hazel, Genevieve, and Gertrude. And her other daughter, Winifred, had already passed away by the time this photo was taken. I also knew that they were celebrating this table, which is actually part of the collections here in the museum. There was a big push around the centennial year to have people donate items of significance to the province. So they had fixed up this table that had come from the original Kerry Castle, which was the first government house, the first house of the Lieutenant Governor here. And they had salvaged it and kept it for years. And what you don't see in the record, either in the archival record or in the museum record, is that this table exists because it was lovingly cared for and restored by women. None of that information is in that record, but I know that from the oral histories passed down through my family, which luckily for me at some point were lovingly recorded by a great aunt who wrote memoirs. And these stories they live on in our family, but they're not necessarily things you can find if you're studying history and going into the archives. Now, when I was a kid, I was so interested in this history for all the reasons I've mentioned. And then I also had access to heritage sites that were local. So we went to Craigflower Manor every year with my school. It was a big school trip. There would be costumed interpreters there, and we get to go inside this really interesting old house. Of course, in those days, they really pushed the pioneer history aspect of it. So we were hearing a very particular version of what happened there, but it was fascinating. And when we went inside, there was evidence of women everywhere. So those stories that I'd heard growing up about what women were doing in the homes and with their families, those were on display. Now, it was a very particular version of women's history that was on display in heritage sites in the 80s, very much focused on domestic work, on cooking and cleaning and raising children, but they were there and they were everywhere inside the house, and I loved it. I wanted to soak it up as much as I could. I was so excited by it. I would ask my parents constantly to take me to these old Victorian homes that were restored all over the Lower Mainland and on the island. And when I was 10, I begged my parents to take me to Barkerville for a vacation, which they very kindly did. I was a very nerdy child from an early age. So going into those sites got me first interested in how stories can be told. Now I want to focus a little bit on a couple specific stories that are currently things that I've learned about through heritage sites. So these are women that their stories are being captured right now in a couple of the heritage sites that the province owns and manages. These are the names here. I'm actually starting with the Kilbys first, then Maud Menton, and then I'll go to Sophie Johnson and Rose Charlie at the end. This is the Kilby General Store Museum. Has anyone here ever been to Kilby? Oh, good. A couple people. I went to Kilby when I was a child because my Uncle Ray, who you saw earlier, was living in Agassiz, which is really close by. But I think if you have no reason to go to that region, it's really easy to miss. And I'm going to show you some maps in a minute. Kilby actually, until fairly recently, I think into the 60s, was only accessible by train or boat. So it's not something that was easy. It's not a place that was easy to get to. The Kilby General Store was opened in 1906. Sorry, give me 1 second. It was opened in 1906 by Thomas and Eliza Kilby. And Eliza Kilby, I'm going to talk about in a minute a little bit deeper, but it continued on. It was run by their children, Acton and his wife, Jessie, for many years, all the way up until the 70s when it was purchased by the province of BC to be run as a heritage site. And again, I'll talk about that in a minute. The store was a hub for the community. It had a post office. It was the place where people came and gathered. Like I mentioned before, a lot of small towns have this one public space, which is the place where everything happens. It's the place where you go for information, to meet with your neighbors. So it's a really important key spot. Interestingly, Eliza, so from that first generation of Kilbys, Eliza actually ran a hotel for a few years out of the store. And that's something that you can see when you go to the heritage site now. So when you go to the heritage site, you go in, and the main part of it, the first thing you see is the big store, and it's restored to a certain period. I think they switch it up periodically, but you get to go in and see what it would have been like in the store at a particular period in time and learn all about what that was like. And the post office is set up so you can see it, and then you can go in and see the living quarters. You can also see a bit of the hotel, but what I find really interesting about the story that's told through these spaces is that Eliza Kilby, the hotel was her domain. She ran the hotel, but her business had to operate out of their living quarters. The shop and the post office were nice big spaces that her husband ran his businesses out of, but hers had to be sort of done in the domestic space where most women did their work. So even though she was running a business, she was still physically operating it out of her living space, which I think is interesting. This is an image of the hotel. So as you go through the site, you can go up and see a recreation of some of the hotel rooms and imagine what it was like. And again, this being a spot that was relatively inaccessible, but it was also a spot where people were traveling to for a number of reasons. A lot of people started their stay in the region at this hotel. So traveling salesmen, school teachers, folks that were going to work on the railway, all these people would come and stop there before they found lodging that they could stay in longer term. Now later, Jessie Kilby is a really interesting figure. She's the one looking down at her friend's child, and then in the other image, she's standing with her husband Acton later in life. When they took over, they went and lived on the site while Acton's parents were still running the site. And then eventually they took over the business, but they also expanded it quite significantly. They bought up some row houses and some other buildings, and they made a much larger business out of it. Jessie kept really good records, and she really ran all of the businesses for a long time. Her husband would travel for work, and she was left to run the farm, the post office, the shop itself. They didn't have a hotel anymore at that point, but there was plenty to keep her busy. So she's really instrumental in the operation of this site. And then what I think is so fascinating is in 1972, when the province bought it to turn it into a heritage site, she and her husband actually stayed on as curators for the next 5 years. So they were the first curators of the heritage site. So they really got to build the story and tell their story. So you see a lot of that in evidence in the way the stories about the site are told today. And I think it's a really beautiful way for her to be involved in the way things were changing so significantly in the province at that time. And she really put her stamp on it, which is great. Now I wanted to show you some maps so you can get a sense of what this location is like. So you can see where it says Kilby Museum and Campground on that little point. And then you can see the Scowlitz First Nation, and just above outside of the shot is Chehalis. And the train goes right across, it's right outside, the whole building shakes when the train goes by. But there's a lot of water traffic. It's a really fascinating little part of the province. And here is a bigger image of where it is in comparison to the Lower Mainland. So it's not far off the number 7 highway if you're ever driving out that way. Another person that is connected to the Kilby Heritage Site is Maud Menton. And I wish I could do an entire presentation on each of these women. The curators at these sites were so generous in sharing information with me, and I know so much more about them now, and I wish I could do longer presentations on each of them. Maud Menton grew up in Harrison Mills, so in the community that's right next to where Kilby is. Her family moved out there, I believe from Ontario, and when they first got there was no school anywhere nearby. So she was homeschooled for a long time, and then a little one-room schoolhouse was opened, and it was across the water from where they were living. Somebody from the Scowlitz First Nation would take her across the water every morning in a canoe to make sure that she got to the little one-room schoolhouse where she was doing her education. She went on to get her medical degree. She eventually got a PhD, and she became one of the first female pathologists in North America. She had a long career in Pittsburgh for most of it, in a number of places. She wrote some groundbreaking medical theories and dissertations. I'm probably getting all the scientific words wrong, but she's an incredibly, incredibly talented woman. And I had never heard of her before I went to Kilby. And I think one of the interesting things that sites like Kilby can do is because they are so local, they're so specific to a particular spot, they can take advantage of telling stories about people like Maud that might not have a space to be told elsewhere. So Maud's story is amazing, but maybe there isn't space in another part of the province to tell it. Maybe it's being told in Pittsburgh, where she spent most of her career, but you know, to hear it here where she lived, and that to make that connection of she lived in this incredibly remote place. When you're there at the site, you really get a sense of how remote it was. And from that beginning, she went on to do these incredible things. This image is one panel of a display that was done a few years ago by a summer student. It was a temporary display, but the site has intentions of making a permanent display about Maud soon. The other thing that I think these heritage sites can do is they often have a little more freedom with space, because I don't think there's really an appetite to go through a heritage site and see every room recreated as another bedroom. So there's often, you know, you have one bedroom recreated, and then there's space to do other exhibits and make room for interesting stories that you can tell there. The last story I'm going to tell is not, it's about a person, it's about a number of people, but it's specifically about an object. This object is at a provincial heritage site. It's on display at Yale, but it's an object that tells an incredible story itself and is sort of a portal to learning more about a particular time and group of people. For the archivists in the room, I think of this object as an archival record itself. It contains the story, and it's that sort of entryway in the same way that a photograph or a document would be. It's that way to kind of lead you to learning more about something that happened. So this is the piano that saved lives, or sometimes it's referred to as the peace piano. This piano has a long history. It was made in 1853. The history is connected to a woman named Sophie Peter. Sophie Peter was an, I'm sorry, I'm hesitating on the pronunciation, an Inklakatma woman from Skewett, which is on the map. You can see that there. If you know where the old Alexander Bridge is, it's very close to the old Alexander Bridge. She married a man named James Johnson, who was a settler. And from the way the stories are told that have been passed down, is it was a real love story. They were very happy and very in love. James Johnson found some gold, as many people were doing at the time, and he wanted to give his wife the best of the best. And at the time, the biggest status symbol that he could think of was to get her a piano. So he had this piano brought all the way over from Boston. When it arrived at Yale, it had to be carried by 6 men from Yale to her home. And I'm going to show another map afterwards where you'll get a sense of just how far that is. That's a long way to carry a piano. When she got the piano, this was during the time of the Fraser Canyon War. And this is something that I think is a story that this piano can open people up to learning about that they may not have otherwise learned about. When I studied history in elementary school, I didn't learn about the Fraser Canyon War. I learned about the gold rush. I learned about prospectors. I learned that there was some violence, but I didn't learn specifically about this pretty significant incident that happened in 1858, where the violence escalated to the point where some prospectors were murdering Indigenous people to get to the gold. So in most cases, what was happening is that the Indigenous people were fishing in the river, and the prospectors wanted to get to the gold. They were angry that the Indigenous people were disturbing the creek beds, not giving them access to where they wanted to be prospecting, and it got to the point where they would simply shoot people to get to where they wanted to go. Now, this piano is called the piano that saved lives for a specific reason. I'm going to play a very short clip of Rose Charlie, who's a descendant of Sophie Peter and was the caretaker of the piano for many years, talking about it. Now, how do I do this part? Do I just click on it?
I hope so.
Oh, slipped it. And if it doesn't work, I'll just talk about it.
Sorry, it doesn't seem to want to
Okay.
come up.
Sorry about that. If you look online, there's a lovely little YouTube clip that was made for the Yale Heritage Site of Rose Charlie, who was for many years the caretaker of this particular object, talking about it. What happened is that Sophie Peters herself and her family were extremely musically talented, and they learned to play popular songs of the day, like "Oh Susanna," those sorts of things. And they learned to play them, and because of how remote their location was, There was all these prospectors there. There was all this unrest. But they provided a space where people could come in and be entertained. So they opened their doors to their house to all of these people traveling through. They provided them a place to come together and to socialize. They played music. They had fun. And it gave them a place to kind of decompress after a long day of prospecting for gold. And as a result, the piano came to be known as the piano that saved lives. And it was understood that if it weren't for that piano, their family and their community wouldn't have been spared the way it was. So this is showing the map. You can see Yale up. After each of the descendants of the original owners of this piano, they understood the importance and the value of this piano, so they kept it for generations. It moved from Skewett, which is where the red dot is. It moved all the way to Scowlitz, and then eventually to Chehalis, and then eventually Rose Charlie, with the help of Marion Robinson, who was one of the women I listed on that previous slide, and a few other people, they were able to get it to the Yale Historic Site where it could be put on display and have its story told for anyone who came through. So the piano is currently undergoing some restoration, but it is on long-term loan to the site. It is owned by the descendants of Sophie Peter and the descendants of Rose Charlie. Rose Charlie died a few years ago. And they're the caretakers, but it is on display. It will be back on display soon for people to learn about the story. And the thing I think that's incredible about that story is not only does it tell this amazing story about Sophie Peter and the incidents that happened around that time, but it also is a chance for us to learn about Rose Charlie. She, having her video talking about it in the site, that may be the first time anyone's ever heard of Rose Charlie. I'm not going to go through her biography because it is extensive, but I'm just going to read just a few of the things that she accomplished in her lifetime. She started the Indian Homemakers Association. She was the president of it for 20 years, so she was a huge supporter of Indigenous women's rights, and you'll see that in everything I list here. The Indian Homemakers Association published the monthly newsletter, The Indigenous Voice, which was an incredibly important publication for decades. She contributed to the foundation of the National Indian Brotherhood, which is now the Assembly of First Nations, and the BC Association of Non-Status Indians. She's a founder of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and was later a Grand Chief. She helped establish the National Association of Indian Rights for Indian Women in 1977, and then the Native Women's Association of Canada. And probably most significantly, she fought for decades to remove Section 12(1)B of the Indian Act, which stripped women of the Indian status if they married non-status men. This led to Bill C-31, which amended the Indian Act in June 1985, restoring status to over 45,000 women and children. So that was really important. It was a huge thing that she did. And this, having her on display, her voice on display, talking about an object that she had in her family, again, is a little bit of an entry into learning more about her. And I highly encourage you all to look up this book, which has a whole chapter on her, as well as lots of other women in BC. It's called Mainstays, Women Who Shaped BC. Fascinating book. There's a copy in the BC Archives Library and in the Greater Victoria Public Library in the Heritage Room. So if you want to learn more about women in BC, that's a recommendation. So those are just a few stories. I'm ending on a slide with a picture of my very cute mother when she was a baby. So thanks, Mom, if she ever gets to see this. So I thought I'd end that way for Women's History Day. But if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take questions.